Nobody at the fairground can say why the dog picked that one fence post to die on, and nobody has thought to ask what used to stand there. From behind the funnel cake trailer, Lorraine Dabney watched the crowd swell at the north lot and elbowed the man frying dough beside her. "That's the third fellow they've sent at that dog today," she said. "Look at him, still as a fence post himself." Across the aisle, a man selling honey from mason jars shook his head slow. $10,000, he said, like the number itself was the strange part. Stranger than a Malinois, lying rigid in the dirt, with his ribs going like a bellows, and his eyes fixed on one particular post, the way some men fix on a debt they intend to collect. Neither vendor had approached the fence. Nobody had, except the two who were paid to, and the dog wouldn't let close. Dalton Sinclair climbed onto the tailgate of his truck, with a laminated run sheet clipped to his belt, and the crowd came together the way crowds do, drawn less by the dog than by the promise of a number. "Folks," he called out, working the kind of grin that had gotten him promoted twice, "I've got $10,000 of this company's money that says somebody here can get that animal off this fence line before Saturday's opening ceremony." Retired K9, 7 years old, decorated detection dog, and for 11 days running, he has refused his handler, refused his kennel, and refused his supper. He let that sit. Anybody feels lucky, the fence gate's right there. Marsh did not lift his head at the noise. His ears swiveled once toward the crowd, and then back down toward the packed earth at the base of a single fence post, as if the post were the only thing in the lot worth his attention, as if $10,000 and 40 strangers amounted to less than whatever he was guarding. At the back edge of the gathering, in a canvas barn coat gone soft and pale at the shoulders, an old man stood with his hands loose at his sides and did not press forward. Norris Overby had the look of someone waiting on a bus that was already late and in no hurry regardless. He watched the dog, not the tailgate, not the money. A young woman in a contractor's polo shirt, kneeling at what safe distance the animal allowed, glanced back once at the crowd and caught, for half a second, the old man's stillness. Not the stillness of a man who didn't understand what he was seeing, but the stillness of one who understood it entirely and was waiting for someone to ask him the right question. If you've ever watched an animal grieve something you couldn't see, you already know what's coming. Norris Overby had come to the Hollow Ridge County Fair every year for longer than most of the vendors around him had been alive, and if anyone had ever asked him why, he would have given them an answer short enough to fit in a coat pocket and left it at that. He came because it was the 1 week a year the whole county gathered in one place, and because there were things a man owed that were easier paid, where people gathered. Nobody asked. He was easy not to notice. 74 years old, a barn coat mended at both elbows in the same even, hand-sewn stitch, worn open over a plain collared shirt, his left shoulder held low and fixed, so that when he reached for anything, he turned his whole body toward it, rather than crossing his arm over his chest. The fairground crowd read that stiffness as an old man's slowness, the kind that made people step around him at the gate without quite looking at his face. Marsh, when the wind carried Norris's scent across the lot for the first time that morning, had read it as something else entirely, as a stillness that made no demands of him, though nobody watching could have said how they knew that, only that the dog's ears had turned once and settled. In the left pocket of that coat, folded into a square no bigger than a checkbook, was a strip of ticking fabric, cut decades ago from a decommissioned kennel blanket, its herringbone stripe gone the color of weak coffee with age. At one corner, a knot. Norris untied and retied that knot once a year, always at the fair, always alone, always without ceremony. A small private labor he performed, the way another man might wind a watch that no longer needed winding. Nobody had ever asked him why he carried it. He had never offered. Imani Cadwallader noticed him before she noticed she was noticing. 24 years old, 6 months into the job, she had been kneeling at the edge of Marsh's allowed distance for the better part of an hour, trying the offered hand, the low voice, the small dish of food he would not touch, and getting nothing back but the dog's fixed attention on the post, 12 feet away. She was good at her work in the way that showed itself in small corrections, the angle of her wrist when she extended a palm, the patience in how long she waited before she moved again, And it was that same attentiveness that let her clock, across the lot, an old man in a barn coat, who was not watching the crowd, was not watching Dalton on his tailgate, was watching Marsh's ears with the specific focus of someone reading a language. The two paid trainers who had already failed that morning had watched the dog's whole body, looking for aggression, for fear, for the shapes their training manuals gave names to. Norris was watching only the ears, and the set of the jaw, and where the nose pointed when the wind shifted. Imani filed the sight away without deciding to. She had 6 months of instinct, telling her the two contracted men were missing something the dog kept trying to say, and no standing at all to say so herself. Dalton Sinclair, 33 years old, had built his morning around a number and a laminated sheet, and neither had prepared him for an audience that outgrew his patience. When a fairground board member, a heavyset man named Renfro, who chaired the grounds committee and had already asked twice, pointedly, what the liability exposure looked like, pressed him for a timeline, Dalton consulted the run sheet clipped at his belt as if it might have grown a new line since he'd last looked, and said the crew would have an answer before the ceremony, or the dog would be formally assessed unfit and reassigned. It was the kind of sentence that sounded like confidence and cost him nothing to say. He didn't know yet what it would cost him to be wrong. It was Renfro who spotted the old man drifting toward the fence line and said, loud enough to carry, "Sir, you'll want to stay back of the tape. This here's a working operation." Norris nodded once, easy, and did not move any closer than he already had, though he did not move back either. Dalton, catching the exchange from his tailgate, saw an opening for the kind of laugh that plays well to a crowd. "That's all right, Frank," he called down, loose and grinning. "Let him look. Man's probably just here for the funnel cakes." A ripple of laughter went through the nearer edge of the crowd, the easy kind that costs nobody anything, and Dalton warmed to it the way men do when a room agrees with them. "We appreciate the interest, sir, truly," he said, pitching his voice for the onlookers now more than for Norris. "But this is a professional operation. We've had 2 certified handlers work this animal already today, top of their field, real credentials, and if they couldn't move him, I don't imagine." He paused, letting the crowd fill in the rest. "Well, no offense meant. This challenge is for professionals, not for spectators." Norris said nothing. He had the kind of quiet that didn't ask to be noticed, and so mostly it wasn't. He looked at Dalton for a moment, the way a man looks at weather he has seen before and knows the shape of, then turned his attention back to the fence, where Marsh had gone rigid again at the sound of raised voices, ears flat, gaze locked on the post. Somewhere behind Dalton, Imani had gone very quiet, watching the exchange with her jaw set in a way that suggested she had an opinion she wasn't yet permitted to spend. 2 failed attempts, Dalton went on, warming further, ticking items off the laminated sheet as if reciting them made them truer. State-certified behavioral specialist out of the regional academy. Another out of Fairview, worked patrol dogs for 11 years. Both of them tell me this animal's grief-locked, maybe past bringing back, and that's a hard thing to hear. Folks, I know it is, but it's the honest professional assessment, and I'm not going to stand up here and pretend an amateur's going to walk in and undo what trained specialists couldn't. He looked toward Norris one more time, not unkindly exactly, but with the particular carelessness of a man who has already decided a person doesn't factor into his morning. "Appreciate you coming out, sir. Fair's got plenty else to see." Norris tipped his head, the barest acknowledgement, and stepped back half a pace, not out of the lot, only out of the tape line, and settled again to watching, his hands loose at his sides, his bad shoulder set low and easy, the posture of a man in no rush to prove anyone wrong. Renfro, satisfied, turned back to his clipboard notes about liability. The crowd's attention swung back to the fence, where the 2 contracted trainers, given the floor again, were already conferring in low voices about a 3rd attempt. The taller of the 2 men, young, earnest, wearing the Regional Academy's polo shirt with its embroidered crest, knelt at the edge of Marsh's tolerance and tried a slow approach, palm down, murmuring the calm command phrases his training had given him. Marsh's eyes tracked him the whole way, but his body didn't unbend an inch from its fixed line toward the post. When the trainer reached toward the leash clipped slack at the dog's collar, Marsh came up onto his front paws with a low sound that wasn't quite a growl, more a warning, pitched just under 1, and the trainer withdrew his hand and sat back on his heels, defeated a second time that morning. "He's not aggressive," the trainer said to Dalton, loud enough for the board to hear, "defensive already. He's fixated. I've seen fixation before. It usually breaks with distraction, food, a toy, a command reset, but he's not taking any of it. I'd call this beyond standard behavioral range." The second trainer, older, arms crossed, offered his own diagnosis with the confidence of 11 years patrol experience behind him. "Grief-locked," he said again, the phrase Dalton had already borrowed once. "Sometimes you get a dog who loses a working partner or ages out of a role and just shuts the door. I've read case studies. It's rare, but it happens, and once it does, there's not a command in the book that reopens it." Norris, from his place outside the tape, watched none of this with the interest the crowd was giving it. He watched instead the dog's ears, which had not, in either failed approach, so much as flicked toward the trainers. They had stayed leveled at the post the whole time, tracking not sound but ground, the way a man's eyes track a word he's trying to read from across a room. And he watched the pause, not the trembling the trainers kept describing to the board as distress, but a specific, repeated motion, one foreleg scraping twice at the same 6 inches of packed dirt, stopping, resetting, scraping again, with the patient repetition of a task half finished, rather than the scattershot digging of panic. Renfro, arms folded, had begun checking his watch with the frequency of a man doing arithmetic he didn't like. 2 professionals, 2 failures, he said to Dalton, not quietly. "I've got a paving crew booked for Saturday morning and a ceremony to run rain or shine. I need this resolved, not diagnosed." Dalton's grin had thinned considerably since the tailgate. He consulted his run sheet again, as if the laminate might offer a third name to try, and found nothing printed there but the 2 he'd already spent. It was Imani who broke the quiet that followed, though she didn't intend the words to carry as far as they did. Kneeling near the fence, she said, mostly to herself, "He's not scared of that post. He's asking it something." Nobody answered her. The older trainer gave her the kind of look reserved for junior staff who speak out of turn, and she dropped her eyes back to her clipboard, coloring, though she didn't take the observation back in her own mind, only in her mouth. Norris heard her anyway. It was the first thing said all morning that matched what his own eyes had been telling him, and something in the set of his jaw eased a fraction, the way a man's face changes when a stranger says aloud the thing he's been holding privately. He didn't speak yet. He had spent long enough of his life watching working dogs to know that a man's word, offered too early, only crowds a moment that isn't ready to be crowded. He waited, hands still loose, shoulders still low, while the 2 trainers argued in murmurs about whether a sedative consult was warranted, while Renfro's watch-checking sped up, while Dalton's grin finally gave out altogether under the weight of a morning going nowhere. The wind shifted, faint, carrying dust, and the smell of fried food and diesel off the midway, and Marsh's nose lifted a half-inch to read it, before dropping back to the ground at the post, unsatisfied by whatever the air had told him. Norris watched that small motion the way another man might watch a gauge needle settle, and in his coat pocket his fingers found the folded square of ticking fabric without his eyes ever leaving the dog, an old habit surfacing the way habits do, unbidden, exactly when they're needed. Nobody had asked him to step forward, but nobody, watching that morning, had asked the ground the right question either, and Norris Overby had spent 22 years of his life learning that a dog will answer honestly long before a person thinks to ask. Renfro's watch-checking finally curdled into a decision. "Give it one more try," he said to Dalton, "and if the animal's still locked up by noon, I want him crated and reassessed off the grounds. I'm not risking a bite report 3 days out from opening ceremony." Dalton nodded, jaw tight, and it was in the small silence after that decision, with the crowd's attention sagging toward disappointment, that Norris finally stepped past the tape. He didn't ask permission, and he didn't announce himself. He crossed the lot with the economy of a man who had learned long ago not to waste motion, his bad shoulder held level, his weight settling forward onto his back foot, before each step the way a man moves when a knee or a joint has taught him exactly how much give the ground has left in it. Dalton opened his mouth to object, but Renfro, oddly, lifted a hand to stay him, curiosity, or exhaustion, or both, and let the old man come. Norris knelt at a distance Marsh's own body had set for him hours ago, lowering himself in stages, one hand briefly finding the fence rail for balance, and then releasing it once his weight had settled. He didn't reach toward the dog. He reached instead into his coat pocket, unhurried, and drew out the small folded square of ticking fabric, the knot at its corner, freshly tied that very morning, and set it on the ground between himself and Marsh, not offered to the dog's nose, not pushed forward, simply placed, the way a man sets down an object he trusts will be noticed in its own time. The trainers exchanged a look. Dalton opened his mouth again. Renfro said nothing at all, watching now with the stillness of a man who senses, without being able to say why, that something is about to happen that his liability forms have no category for. Marsh's ears came up first. Then his nose, swinging low and slow toward the fabric, working it the way a dog works something old and half-remembered, not sniffing so much as reading. His trembling, the fine, constant shiver that had run through him since dawn, did not stop all at once. It eased in stages, the way a held breath lets out in increments when a person is deciding whether it's safe to release it fully. Norris did not speak. He did not reach out. He let the dog take as long as the dog required, and the crowd, without anyone telling it to, went quiet in a way it had not managed all morning. Not from Dalton's number, not from Renfro's threats, but from the simple sight of an old man asking nothing, and a dog beginning, slowly, to answer. Marsh rose. It was not a sudden thing. First the haunches, then the forequarters, a slow unfolding of a body that had held one position for 11 days, and when he was fully up, he did not go to the fabric or to Norris. He turned, instead, along the fence line, walking with his nose low, and Norris rose with him in the same unhurried stages he'd used to kneel, following at the pace the dog set rather than the reverse. Nobody in the crowd moved. Even Renfro's watch stayed unchecked in his hand. The dog walked 20 feet along the fence and stopped at a single post, not the one he'd fixated on since dawn, but a twin post 4 spans down, weathered gray, half swallowed by grass at its base, and there he lay down again, but differently this time, not rigid, not braced, but settled, the particular loose-shouldered posture of an animal who has arrived somewhere, rather than one holding a line against something. Then he began to dig, one foreleg, then the other, steady and unhurried, packing dirt aside in small, deliberate amounts, the motion of a task, long overdue, rather than an animal in distress. Norris knelt again beside him, one hand resting, at last, on the dog's shoulder, the first touch either of them had allowed all morning, and said nothing at all, because there was nothing yet worth saying, only a thing worth watching. The crowd stood in a silence that had weight to it, the kind that follows an unmistakable fact into a room and leaves no space for anyone's run sheet or credential to answer it. Dalton stood on his tailgate with his laminated sheet hanging forgotten at his belt, watching a result his firm's 2 professionals, his morning's whole operation, and his own $10,000 had failed to produce, arrive instead from an old man who had asked for none of it, and said, so far, exactly nothing at all. The quiet held for the length of maybe 6 breaths before Renfro's voice cracked it open again, not unkindly, but with the particular urgency of a man whose problem has just changed shape, without becoming any less his problem. Hold on, he said, stepping toward the fence with his phone already out, thumbing toward whoever managed the grounds crew. If there's something buried there, I want it filled and re-fenced before end of day. I've got a paving crew coming Saturday at 6 sharp, and I am not delaying a fairground opening over a hole in the dirt. With respect, Norris said, still kneeling, still watching the dog work, he's not digging at nothing. It was the first full sentence he'd spoken all morning, and it came out plain, unhurried, carrying no more weight than a man commenting on weather, though it landed in the crowd like something heavier. Dalton, sensing the morning story sliding away from him and toward a stranger in a barn coat, climbed down off the tailgate fast enough that his boots kicked up dust, and inserted himself between Renfro and the fence with the particular energy of a man trying to reclaim a room. "This is exactly the kind of behavioral breakthrough our team's methodology is built around," he said, loud, already reaching for the version of the morning he could carry back to his district director. "We use scent anchoring techniques as a standard second-tier intervention when—" "Wasn't your method," Imani said, quiet, from where she knelt a few feet off, and though she said it mostly to herself again, this time it carried, and this time nobody looked away from her fast enough to pretend they hadn't heard it. Renfro's eyes moved from Dalton to Norris, to the dog and back, doing the same arithmetic the crowd was doing, and it didn't sit easy on him. "I don't know who you are," he said to Norris, not unkindly, but not gently either, the tone of a man protecting a morning he no longer fully controlled. "And I appreciate whatever it is you did here, but I've got a board to answer to and a schedule that doesn't move for a dog digging a hole, so if you're not attached to this firm in some official capacity, I'm going to need you back of the tape while we sort out what we're looking at." Norris didn't argue it. He didn't explain himself either. Not the 22 years, not the folded fabric, not why his hand had known exactly how long to wait before it touched the dog's shoulder. He simply nodded once, the same easy tip of the head he'd given Dalton that morning, and made to rise, one hand finding the fence rail again for balance, prepared to step back and let the crowd's momentum carry the morning wherever it was going to go without him. It was Marsh who stopped him, not by any command, but by leaning his full weight, suddenly, against Norris's kneeling leg, a gesture that had nothing to do with digging or fear, and everything to do with a dog declining, quietly, to let the one person who'd answered him walk away yet. Norris settled back down without a word. Renfro, phone still in hand, watched that small refusal happen, and found, for reasons he couldn't have named to his board, that he didn't press the point again. The dig went another 11 minutes before a trowel, fetched at last by one of the grounds crew, since nobody was willing to pull Marsh off the spot by hand, struck something that wasn't root or rock. Imani, kneeling close now with Norris's quiet nod as her only permission, worked the dirt back with careful fingers until a shape came clear. Small, rectangular, rust-scaled at the seams, a metal tin no bigger than a lunch pail, its lid fused half shut with decades of oxidation. "There's writing," she said, angling it toward the light, and the crowd, which had gone quiet for the dog, went quieter still for the object, the particular hush that gathers around something old enough to have outlasted the people who buried it. Dalton crouched beside her, reaching for his phone to photograph it before anyone else could claim the discovery as theirs, and Renfro, despite himself, leaned in too. The stamp on the lid was faint but legible, once Imani rubbed the worst of the rust away with her thumb. A unit designation, a set of numbers, the particular clipped abbreviation of a National Guard training detachment, decades gone. Imani pried at the fused seam, with careful patience until it gave, and the lid came away to reveal nothing. No papers, no medals, no relic worth the morning's drama. Just empty tin, its interior scoured clean by rust and time, and a silence that had, a moment ago, felt like anticipation and now felt, plainly, like disappointment. "That's it?" Imani said, and her voice had lost the certainty it carried 30 seconds earlier. He tore his own paws bloody for 11 days over an empty box. She looked to Norris for something, an answer, a correction, anything, and found him still kneeling, still quiet, his hand resting on Marsh's shoulder, his face giving away nothing at all, though his eyes had not left the tin since it came out of the ground. It was a voice from the edge of the gathering crowd that answered instead, a voice carrying the particular authority of someone who had not needed to raise it to be heard. "That box was never empty when it went in the ground," the man said, stepping through the parting crowd with the deliberate bearing of someone twice Dalton's age and twice as certain of his footing. "It's empty now, because 60 years is a long time for oxidation to work on a set of dog tags. Tobias Gant, 68. retired Master Gunnery Sergeant, and a name on the Fairgrounds Veterans Advisory Board that most people present had only ever seen printed on a program, came to a stop at the fence line and looked down at the tin the way a man looks at a photograph of someone he used to know. "You recognize the stamp," Renfro said, some of the impatience gone out of his voice now, replaced by something more careful. "I trained under that detachment before it was decommissioned," Tobias said. 1961, this field was still guard land, before the county bought it off for the fair. They kept a K-9 unit here, small, 3-4 dogs, mostly demonstration and training work. There was a dog named Rye, best nose in that detachment by every account I ever heard, and he died in service here, old age, nothing dramatic, and they buried him at the fence line because that's where the handlers used to run him every morning before drill. He crouched, slow, and touched 2 fingers briefly to the rusted lid. This would have held his tags. Somebody wanted him remembered by name, not just by a line in a logbook. Imani's disappointment folded, in the space of that explanation, into something closer to reverence, though it took her a moment to find her voice again. "So Marsh wasn't grieving nothing," she said. "He was guarding somebody." "He was doing what a good dog does," Tobias said simply, and something in the way he said it made the crowd's remaining murmur die down entirely. Renfro, phone still half raised, lowered it slowly. "If this ground's a burial site," he said, thinking it through as he spoke, "county's got protections for that, historical marker rules. At minimum, I need to see whatever's on file before that paving crew comes anywhere near this fence." He turned to Dalton. "Your firm's had this contract 3 years. You ever pull the county plot records on this lot?" Dalton's confidence, worn thin all morning, went out entirely at the question. Yes, he said, slower now. 3 years back, when we took over grounds maintenance, I filed the paperwork to streamline fence upkeep across the whole lot. Consolidated a couple of old designations so we wouldn't need separate permits for separate sections." He stopped. Something was assembling itself behind his eyes that he did not want finished. "One of those designations," he said, quieter, "was a protected marker status. I didn't know what it was protecting, I just knew it was slowing down maintenance requests, and I had a budget to hit that quarter." Tobias looked at him for a long moment, not unkindly, the way an old NCO looks at a young one who has just told on himself without being asked. "Then it wasn't the county that lost this grave," he said. "It was you." Norris, still kneeling, still with his hand on Marsh's shoulder, said nothing at all to that, though the dog beneath his hand had gone, at last, entirely still, not the rigid stillness of the morning, but something closer to rest. Norris let the quiet hold a while before he spoke, the way he'd let Marsh hold his own quiet earlier, trusting it to finish its own work before words crowded in. When he did speak, it was to Tobias first, one old man to another, the two of them briefly the only people at that fence line who understood the shape of what had just been uncovered. "I ran burial detail for 11 years, Norris said. "Not just the ceremony part, the part before it, where somebody has to decide where a dog gets to rest and make sure the paperwork says so plain enough that nobody paves over him by accident 30 years on." He looked down at the tin, empty in Imani's hands, and something in his face eased. Briefly, the way a man's face eases when a private ledger he's carried a long time finally squares. "Rye's not the first working dog I've stood over. Won't be the last, probably, though I'm getting too old to be much use kneeling anymore." He said it plainly, without complaint, the flat statement of a man reporting weather rather than confessing pain. Imani, still holding the tin, asked the question the whole gathering seemed to be circling without quite landing on. "How'd you know to bring the rag? How'd you know that'd work when nothing else did?" Norris was quiet a moment, and when he answered it was not with method, though method was buried somewhere in it. "My wife used to run a little kennel of her own," he said. "Rescues, mostly. Dogs other people had given up on for one reason or another. Half the county called them strays. Bernice never once called them that. She called it the wrong paperwork, and fixed it." He touched the fold of ticking cloth still lying on the ground where he'd first set it down, the knot at its corner catching the light. "She used to say a dog earns the truth of its own name, same as anybody. Spend enough years around dogs that have lost that truth, you learn to notice when one's trying to get it back. He didn't elaborate further, and nobody in the crowd pressed him to. It was, for a man who rarely gave 3 sentences at a stretch, close to a full accounting, and it was received the way such things are received among people who understand what restraint costs, in silence, and in the particular way, several heads bowed slightly, without anyone directing them to. Dalton stood at the edge of that quiet, with his laminated run sheet still clipped uselessly at his belt, and when he spoke again, it was without the performance that had carried his whole morning. I filed that consolidation because it made the numbers look better at quarter's end, he said, to Renfro, to the board, to the crowd, to nobody's prompting at all. I didn't check what I was consolidating away. That's on me, not the county, not the crew, not some clerical accident. I need that in the record, and I need this ground protected regardless of what it costs my contract. He said it plainly, the words coming out smaller than his tailgate voice had been that morning, and Renfro, watching him say it, seemed to weigh the man differently for having said it than for anything he'd claimed all day. Contract review's not mine to promise you, Renfro said, not unkindly. But I can tell you the board doesn't usually favor a man who buries his own mistake over one who digs it back up. Marsh, through all of it, had not moved from beside the small trench, though something in him had finally let go the last of its held tension. When Imani, almost as an afterthought, set the untouched bowl of food down near his paws, the same bowl he'd refused all morning, all 11 days before it, he lowered his head to it without hesitation and ate, unhurried, while the fence-line crowd watched a dog do the simplest thing in the world as though it were the rarest. Norris rose at last, in the same careful stages he always used, his hand finding the fence rail once more for balance before he let it go. He did not reach for credit. When Renfro, half turning, started to ask his name for whatever record the board would need to keep, Norris only said, "Doesn't need to be about me," and let the folded ticking cloth stay where it lay beside the dog, a small unclaimed comfort for Marsh to keep close while the rest of the morning sorted itself out around him. 6 weeks later, the north fence line of the Hollow Ridge Fairground carried a different look than it had all the years before it. The post Marsh had first fixed on stood undisturbed, and 4 spans down, where the dog had finally chosen to dig, a small granite marker had been set into the ground, its face cut plain and its letters shallow but legible. A name, a unit designation, 2 years bracketing a service, too brief for most records to have bothered keeping. RY, it read, and beneath it, smaller, a line the county clerk had insisted on adding once the paperwork was finally restored to its proper protected status. Working dog, remembered. The paving crew had come and gone around that plot, rather than through it. Per an order Renfro had pushed through the board himself. Citing precedent, nobody until that week had known existed. Dalton Sinclair's firm had kept its contract, in the end, though not without cost. His district director, a man named Beaumont who had been quietly angling to move the whole kennel account to a cheaper outfit, found his pretext gone the moment the story of the buried marker reached the board in full, complete with Dalton's own admission attached to it. Dalton, for his part, had spent the 6 weeks since rewriting the firm's kennel retirement procedure line by line, so that no dog's future was decided again by a scorecard alone. Every assessment now required a signed account from whoever had actually handled the animal day to day, weighted equal to any instrument's readout. It was a small thing, on paper. Imani said it was the first form she'd ever seen that assumed the handler might know something the equipment didn't. Marsh had not gone back to the kennel that housed him before. He'd been reassigned, informally at first, and then by a line of paperwork Imani filed herself, to spend his retirement on the fairground grounds crew's own modest kennel run, close enough to the fence line that he could walk it whenever the mood took him, which was most mornings, unhurried, the way a dog walks a route he has finally been given leave to walk in peace rather than in vigil. Norris came back once more before the season turned, on a quiet weekday with no crowd and no tailgate and no laminated sheet clipped to anyone's belt. He knelt at the marker in the same careful stages he always used, his bad shoulder held low, and from his coat pocket he drew a fresh square of ticking cloth, cut new this time rather than carried decades, and tied into its corner the same knot his fingers had shaped every year without anyone ever asking why. He set it down beside Marsh, who had come to lie at the grave the moment he heard the gate, and did not offer it to the dog's nose so much as leave it near enough to find in his own time the way the first one had been left. Marsh worked it once, briefly, and then settled his head across his paws atop the folded cloth and closed his eyes in the particular ease of an animal with nowhere left he needs to be. Nora stayed a moment longer, one hand resting on the dog's back, saying nothing at all, because there was nothing left that morning that needed saying. Then he rose, turned his whole body the way he always did rather than reaching across himself, and walked back toward the gate, the fair's noise already rising faint behind him from the midway where the season's last crowds were gathering. Some ground remembers longer than any of us do, and it only takes one person willing to kneel down and ask it the right question. He did not look back. He did not need to. The dog was resting, the name was cut into stone, and the cloth would hold its knot until someone, next year, thought to check it again.